In this video, we are questioning traditional practices. Daniel Coyle, who is an author of The Little Book of Talent and the Culture Code and the Talent Code, 3 books, and multiple others, is a professional who studies high performers. So he travels around the world to understand what makes people great and what makes people elite. After he published the work in learning science and psychology, he was invited to observe a Major League Baseball game. Part of the game, he noticed that before the start of the game, a lot of the batters would be hitting these beautiful shots into the stands. So these really wonderful baseball hits. But it was because the pitcher was throwing the ball at like half the speed in compared to the live in-game pitches. The pitches when you throw a ball, that's what a pitch is. And Daniel had asked, this is cool that you're hitting these beautiful shots before the game, but is this really helping your athlete's performance? With that backstory, Catherine, how does that story resonate with you in your experience as a student?
Yeah, I mean, I think so this issue of, practices that that are so ingrained in how we function and work as students that we sort of think that they're natural, right? That there's nothing wrong with them. This is just the way that things have always been. I think for me as a student, there were a lot of those types of practices where I would actually find myself thinking like, why are we doing this? What functions does this serve? How is this going to help me as a student? I think one of the major practices that I really questioned was this issue of annotated bibliographies, which is a really big project because so annotated bibliographies are when you're doing research projects, and instructors will have you do research and find different articles and texts that you want to focus on in your work. And then you have to write like what we call an annotation. So for each of those articles and books that you think are relevant to your research, you actually have to do an explanation of what this text is about, how you find it relevant to your research, how you plan to use it in your research. And I remember when I had to do those, I found them very infuriating. So on the one hand, I knew why my professors were having me do it. It gets students in the habit of writing summaries for what it is that they're reading. It's a way of helping us to organize our research. It's a way of helping us to filter out articles that might not be quite as relevant because you go through a lot of material when you're doing research. So annotated bibliographies can serve as an organizational tool and a quick reference guide, because when you're doing a big research project, you're going through, like 100 articles, and you need to have a way of keeping them organized and also organized in your head as well, because it's easy to forget what these articles are about. So it's like a quick reference system. But it always seemed really unnatural to me. And it wasn't until I started questioning, what is this really serving, particularly in the context of being a student who would then have to submit it to the professors? I was realizing, well, maybe this is serving more as a mechanism for keeping us on track with our research papers than actually helping us think through what it is we want to do with our research papers. As someone whose mind works a little differently than other students' minds and maybe other professors' minds, this kind of exercise wasn't actually useful for me. In fact, it made me feel like research was a chore because I had to ask the same questions of every single article that I was going through. So in the process of asking those questions, like why does this matter? I actually was able to stumble across a process that actually worked for me. So it's not really through annotations for me specifically. but I was able to find a system that worked for me, that was more intuitive to me. So even though I didn't necessarily like that traditional practice, by asking questions about its relevance, why it was being used, what effect it was supposed to have on my learning, I was able to figure out what would have an effect on my learning and create sort of the learning practices and habits that would help me when I was doing my research paper, because they were more reflective and aligned with how my brain actually works when I'm digesting research.
Are you able to summarize that method in 30 seconds?
Not effectively. For me, it's more like as I'm reading through things, I'm taking notes, but it's not in annotation form. So the way that I engage with the articles doesn't follow a structure. It really depends on what it is that I'm reading and what I'm thinking about as I'm reading, which is not necessarily my research question, which is not necessarily the sort of preset questions that we're supposed to be answering in an annotated bibliography. It's more like, what am I really interested about in this article? What's really standing out to me about this article? And the way I process, I actually do better when I'm actually handwriting my notes, because I remember them more. It's almost having like, because of the physical work of handwriting something, I remember things better compared to when I'm typing out my thoughts, because when I'm typing, it's like, I'm just typing, I'm not writing. I don't know how to explain that difference. So I actually get quickly confused if I ever have to transcribe my handwritten notes to typing. So all of my analysis actually comes out through annotating my articles in the margins, and then looking through them and reviewing my notes. I know that Henry was talking about reviewing notes and rewriting notes earlier in one of our earlier recordings. So that's like, I have my own version of that. And then from there, I kind of figure out what it is that I'm really trying to do in this research paper and what's possible.
It's much easier to talk about rewriting your notes than it is to do it. So trust me, I don't rewrite all my notes, although I am working up to rewriting more of my notes. To briefly wrap this video up, for me, one practice that I wish I had a coach help me visualize and help me see and critique is the idea of highlighting or rereading. So those were two study practices I really was invested in, because those are the study practices that kind of worked decently well for me throughout high school. But in my research of learning science, I will leave you with 3 ideas, leave students with 3 ideas, leave whoever, any of our audience members with 3 ideas. Active recall, retrieval practice, and spaced repetition. These practices have allowed me to be able to learn way more effectively. Now, I don't exercise them nearly as much as I want to, but give them a Google, give them a YouTube, and give them a shot if you want to study more effectively. What was the topic of this video? Traditions that questioning traditional practices?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So question your own traditional practices in context of your learning, and you will be amazed.